don't be afraid to dig into whatever topic it is, because you'll find if God is who he says he is, at the end of the day, when you dig in, you're just going to find more evidence that will show you the truth of who he is.
Hey friends, it's Abdu Murray with another installment of Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda is a series of short video segments where I am joined by a friend who engages in apologetics or evangelism regularly, in fact, most of the time for a living, where they speak on platforms, public, they do in private evangelism as well, or they're a writer and a blogger and these kind of things. And we come on and we share stories about when we coulda, shoulda, or woulda done something differently in terms of a conversation we were having or during a Q&A or whatever it is. And the reason for this, and you probably heard me say this before if you've tuned in before, is that we want to encourage you that even when you're a professional speaker, even when you're somebody who writes blogs and regularly engages with non-Christians, you mess up, and what you do is you go back and you think of how you coulda, shoulda, or woulda done it better the next time. And when we do that self-reflection, we get better at the art and science of Christian persuasion. There's a science to it, but there's also an art to it. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, which my guess is probably true even of the hard sciences, which is why I'm joined and pleased to be joined by my friend Jeff Zweerink. Dr. Zweerink is a research scholar with Reasons to Believe. I think you're a senior research scholar, if I'm not mistaken, right, Jeff?
That is the official title at this point.
Okay. Well, he's with Reasons to Believe, which is a wonderful ministry that discusses wonderfully, I think, the interaction of faith and science and how these are not incompatible. These are actually quite compatible, how the book of nature and God's book of special revelation, the Bible, are actually quite compatible in what they reveal to us about reality. I've had the pleasure of speaking with Jeff on various platforms, both domestic and international. In fact, most of the time you and I have spoken together, it's actually been in another country, specifically Lima and the surrounding environs of Lima in Peru, and heard Jeff give talks about science and faith to very diverse audiences there, by the way, from like teens and young people to people who have left their teens quite a bit far behind in the rearview mirror, to great effect as he shows how the compatibility of science and faith really is not science fiction; it's actually science fact and reality as well. So thanks for being on the program. Coulda, shoulda, woulda, Jeff. Great to have you.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Abdu. Looking forward to our conversation and really enjoy interacting with you. So.
Yeah, well, thanks, brother. Appreciate it. So, Jeff, lay it on me. Let's hear about a time when you coulda, shoulda, or woulda done something a little differently now that you've had some time to reflect.
Well, actually, one of the first times I remember and thought, I look back and I still today wish, I should have done something different, is when I was in graduate school. I was actually working down in Arizona, and there was a project I was involved with, and I actually got to work in the group that had the leader of very high energy gamma ray astronomy, and he's the person who put this field on the map, if you will. And I was driving up the mountain with him. We were going up to the telescope, and God put it on my mind to say, hey, why don't you ask him about Jesus? And if I'm honest, I've sat there in the car and I spent about a minute or two of the drive running through all of these. Why shouldn't I speak up? And it's like, he's my boss. I can't do that. He knows more. So I just didn't talk at all. And one of the struggles I have is being unconfident, or it's like I don't have all the answers, so therefore I don't. And so that's kind of if you go to one of the coulda, woulda, shouldas of places where, as I began to be a professional Christian apologist, if you will, I had an opportunity to sit around with some scientists at a table. Was earlier in the day, I had a fellow from NASA who was talking about astrobiology, and I this time decided to speak up and ask the question that God prompted me. And he said, I asked the fellow, goes, what would be, how could you tell the distinction between a created and a naturalistic origin of life? And so by being able to speak up, people in the audience were kind of critical of me, but I was just interacting with the fellow, and I could tell he didn't quite understand the question. So he kind of came back and asked me some questions, and I kind of clarified. And eventually he got down to where it's like, once he understood my question, he goes, never thought about that. So I don't have an answer. I thought, I like that. I respect that.
Mm-hmm.
That set up a conversation later at night where we were around the table, and one of my scientific colleagues, a senior scientific colleague, said, I never thought about the question that way, that you might be able to test the supernatural. And so we had this long 45-minute conversation, and I really didn't say much, just about, could you test it? And some people said, no, you shouldn't, and others you could. And these are all my scientific colleagues. But as we were going through, this was about 15, 20 years ago, and I said, well, if you got a beginning, that kind of looks like there ought to be a beginner. If you've got design, that looks to a designer. That kind of points to God. And the guy looks right at me. He goes, yeah, but in what multiverse are you talking about?
Hmm.
And I'm like, kind of deer in headlights. I don't know what to do with that. I haven't even thought about the multiverse. And so I'm like,
yeah.
Huh. And so I just didn't say anything.
So what would you have done? Reflecting on that now, what would you have said?
Well,
now, two things. Let's say because you've written on the multiverse now, you've actually got quite a bit you could say. But
right.
Let's put you back into. I haven't thought about it much, but how would I respond in a situation where I haven't thought about it much? How should I respond other than deer in the headlights? How could you actually respond without knowing a whole lot in terms of how to respond? How could you respond without being a deer in the headlights?
Yeah, I know that's a great question, because that's part of why I spent so much time researching, is like, I didn't like that answer, so I'm going to have to come back to it. But as I've looked back and I've thought about it, what I failed to do in that moment was apply a lesson that my dad taught me a long time ago. It's like, if you want to have a conversation, ask people questions. And so here's this topic about the multiverse, and I kind of had enough knowledge of it to realize the importance of the statement he was making. It's like, well, if there's this multiverse, there's all this, there's beginnings and fine tuning. There's so much more sample space, so many more things, that it might get rid of the need for a beginning and a fine tuner. But what I didn't do, instead of feeling like I had to have an answer to that, I didn't come back and just ask the fellow questions. So, how would maybe just even ask the question, hey, how would the multiverse get rid of the need for a beginner? And so get an idea of what he's thinking, instead of assuming I know all of this and it's like, oh, I don't have the answer, therefore I can't talk. So just what I would have done then, if I knew then what I knew now, is come back and just started asking him questions. So, hey, well, how would we establish whether the multiverse, is this a scientific idea? Just start having conversation about it and asking questions, because that takes it out of me having to know all the answers to, hey, we're back to having an interesting conversation again. And so that's what I would do.
Yeah. And I think that's this is a critical thing, I think, that people have to understand and really take in for a moment, okay? Because oftentimes people do get paralyzed by a fear, saying, I don't have all the answers. And I do want to, if we could, because we teased it a little bit in sort of the lead into the story. You talked about a time when you could have said something and said nothing. And then here's, so if you're okay with this, could you join me for a part 2? I want to talk about that a little bit more. Are you okay with that?
Yeah, that'd be great. Let's do that.
Okay, great. Well, let's stay back to this one now. This is an important aspect here. So a lot of people get sort of paralyzed by, I don't know enough to have the conversation. Now, friends, I want to point something out to you. Jeff has a PhD in astrophysics. He's an actual dyed-in-the-wool researching astrophysicist, and he got involved in a conversation at one point when you were doing your studies, right? You were in the middle of your studies, is that right?
Actually, this is during one of my postdocs. So I finished my PhD. I'm out working on a job, working on gamma ray astronomy. I was over giving a talk about the research I was doing. And so here I am talking to other researchers who just happen to be in different fields. And in fact, this fellow was a geologist. He wasn't even an astrophysicist. So,
yeah,
but I'm paralyzed because he's got more knowledge than I do of this area.
Yeah, and this is so important because if that's the case, friends, if someone with just qualifications walks into a conversation and suddenly finds himself in an area he doesn't have as much information as he'd like, that's not a reason to not be involved, because the point is that my guess is 90% of the people, maybe even 95% of the people who are listening to this or watching this don't have PhDs in something, let alone the very field we're talking about. So even if you do, that doesn't guarantee you won't run into a situation where you don't know an answer to something or might feel quote unquote stumped by it. But you got to stay involved in the conversation, because you can have a conversation without saying things. You can have a wonderful one by asking something. I just wanted to pause there, Jeff, because that's such an important aspect of the story you just shared. You can stay in a conversation just by asking. And then I love how you put it too. You can have an interesting conversation as opposed to trying to, accomplish something other than having an interesting conversation in the moment, which itself can be its own powerful witness. So yeah, that's thanks for sharing that. That's a wonderful aspect of that whole thing. So now, if you can give us maybe a snippet of now knowing what you do know, because you have since done that. You have a book called Who's Afraid of the Multiverse? I think that there's, it's safe to say that that book's based on quite a bit of level of research now that you've actually taken the time to do that. And by the way, that's another big lesson I think we could learn here too, is that a lot of the information, if I'm hearing you right, a lot of the information you've since gathered about this and since learned about this is in sort of reaction to a situation that you didn't know a whole lot about.
Mm-hmm. It really is. There's even in my interactions with the multiverse, as I began to appreciate that what the multiverse actually was, there was part of my response after that was, oh, you just don't have to worry about the multiverse. It's not that big a deal. You can cast it this way. And I realized, no, we may actually, God have created a multiverse. And I was like, okay, so what do I do with that? And so I had to investigate, is this just an argument where I can't use an argument for a beginning and an argument for a fine tuner because God made things in such a way, not that God doesn't exist, but that's just no longer an apologetic argument that carries weight. And if you go back and look for about a year, I just didn't talk much about a fine tuner because the multiverse is so vast that it might explain away all the fine tuning kind of naturally. And so I began to just read more and try and research and say, okay, if this is the case, how would I still articulate an argument? So I spent a lot of time reading and researching. And as I dug in deeper, what I realized is this first kind of initial, the multiverse gets rid of this evidence. Realize no, it's actually far richer and a far more robust argument for a beginning and for a design, because there were these loopholes in my original argument, if you will, that the multiverse actually closed. It made it a more complex conversation, but it actually made it a far stronger conversation or argument I could make that, yeah, there is a beginning, yeah, there's a designer, and that's still strong evidence pointing to God. So don't be afraid to dig into whatever topic it is, because you'll find if God is who he says he is, at the end of the day, when you dig in, you're just going to find more evidence that will show you the truth of who he is.
Wow. So, boy, that's just such an important thing you just said there. I know there are folks who are afraid to talk to their atheist, Muslim, Hindu, or otherwise skeptical friend of the Christian faith because they're worried that that person might say something that stumps them and gets rid of all the arguments that or at least one of the most important arguments that they've actually shored their faith up on. And what you just shared with us is the fact that if God is real and God has done these things and God has revealed himself to us in the Bible, then arguments may cause us to want to look into things more, but when we do, we'll actually be satisfied. If he's real, he'll provide enough. If you look, you will find. If you seek, you'll find. If you ask, it'll be given. If you knock, it will be answered. So, wow, I think this is really an important insight that our listeners can gain from, is that even when you feel like you're quote unquote stumped, that is just an avenue to learn more and actually make your arguments possibly even more robust. That was such a valuable one, Jeff. Thanks so much for that. We're going to put a pin on this because we're going to come back to a part 2. We're going to talk about a little bit more that time when you actually were prompted to say something and chose not to. But thanks so much for being on this segment of Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Abdu.
So, friends, this has been Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda. This is one worth watching a couple more times, by the way, to get a couple of the insights out, because it was rich with lots of insights I'm sure all of us can relate to. Until next time, and until part 2, where Jeff comes back, this has been Coulda, Shoulda, Woulda.